According to the Edison Electric Institute, EEI, demand for electricity is surging, driven by expanding manufacturing, massive new data centers, electrification, and population growth. And in this high-stakes race to meet energy needs, eyes are increasingly turning to one resource that can deliver reliable, clean power at scale, and that is nuclear energy. Today's episode of Power Perspectives explores how one of the nation's leading utilities is tackling the challenges from all sides by upgrading existing nuclear plants, extending their lifespan, and laying the foundation for a new generation of nuclear technologies. And as a quick reminder to our listeners, full video versions of Power Perspectives are now available on our YouTube channel. Just check the show notes for the link. And I'm Jason Price, coming to you from New York City. And as always, I'm joined by my Energy Central Community Manager, producer of this podcast, Matt Chester, dialing in from Orlando, Florida. So, Matt, what are the kinds of nuclear discussions that are surfacing these days in the Energy Central community?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. When we look around the Energy Central community, I think you definitely see some real enthusiasm in how members are talking about nuclear energy. It's not just here's a legacy baseload resource, but it's also as a flexible carbon-free solution that's seen as the solution to a lot of today's utility challenges. So there's interest and discussion in how existing nuclear fleets can be modernized. Overall, I'd say the conversation, it's moved from if nuclear plays a role there to really how fast and how much can we deploy it.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. And before we dive in, a big thank you to West Monroe, our sponsor of today's episode. So, to discuss this further, we are thrilled to welcome Runette Nader, Vice President of New Nuclear Generation License Renewal at Duke Energy. Runette brings deep insight into Duke's multi-pronged nuclear strategy, from power uprates on existing reactors to long-term license renewal efforts, and looking ahead, preparing for potential deployment of advanced nuclear technologies. Runette Nader, welcome to Energy Central's Power Perspectives podcast.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Runette. We really appreciate you being here. Why don't you start with what your role is at Duke Energy? What is the purpose and service that you're offering? How long you've been with Duke? Just give us a background and sort of set the stage on this discussion today.
So I lead Duke Energy's efforts for new nuclear generation and for subsequent license renewal. And so we'll talk about all of what's going on at Duke Energy in those arenas as we talk through our conversation today. I'm a mechanical engineer by degree from the University of South Carolina. I started my career at Duke Energy right out of college at the Oconee Nuclear Station in Silica, South Carolina. I actually worked on license renewal in the 1990s, the initial license renewal efforts, which we'll talk a little bit about. And then my career has come full circle to work on subsequent license renewal here in the last few years. And so I've worked in engineering, licensing, strategy, worked on new nuclear a couple of decades ago as well. And just I'm very glad to have the opportunity to work on Duke's strategy moving forward for our nuclear fleet.
So let's start with the challenge that's driving this nuclear moment. We've all seen the headlines. The Southeast is booming. Can you give us a sense of just how significant the growth in electricity demand is across Duke Energy's territory and what's behind it?
Sure. So first, for context, Jason, Duke Energy provides electricity across 6 states, including the Carolinas, with North Carolina being our largest jurisdiction. We have the benefit of operating in a part of the country that's attractive to new residents and businesses, in part due to our diverse generation mix. And as you mentioned, we're seeing unprecedented growth in the Carolinas, from data centers to manufacturing to electrification and population growth in general. In 2023 alone, Duke Energy added 195,000 new customers, and that's the largest customer increase we've seen in our history. So turning to nuclear specifically, in our Carolinas Resource Plan, which is like a roadmap for how we'll reliably meet the energy needs of the region, we're projecting the potential to add 11 gigawatts of new nuclear generating capacity by 2050. And so for comparison, 11 gigawatts is the size and capacity of our existing nuclear fleet. So what we're talking about is the potential for doubling our current nuclear fleet. So these plans, the Carolinas Resource Plan that I mentioned, these plans get refreshed every 2 years. And so we're currently updating our load forecast ahead of a filing that we will make this fall. But we're confident that we're going to continue to see the significant growth in the Carolinas. And across all the categories I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of the growth we're seeing in the Carolinas is from always-on industries that require 24/7 power supply, which makes nuclear an ideal fit to match that growth. And policymakers in North and South Carolina have prepared the states for economic success and growth. Our job is to make sure we power the growth.
That's great. That's really helpful context. So let's level set here for our audience. Duke Energy operates the largest regulated nuclear fleet in the United States, and that's a huge asset, particularly in a time of growing demand. Talk to us about what are you doing to squeeze more power, and more years out of these existing reactors? What does that look like? What does that mean? Just help us understand that.
So we do operate the largest nuclear fleet in the country. We have 11 nuclear units at 6 sites. All of our nuclear plants are in the Carolinas. And as we just discussed, we're experiencing unprecedented growth. And we do currently provide 11,000 megawatts or 11 gigawatts from our nuclear plants. And that's just over 50% of the generation in the Carolinas. And it's about 97% of the carbon-free generation in the Carolinas. So we do rely on a diverse mix of generation sources to power the needs of our customers. But nuclear is really essential to that mix and certainly the most reliable form of energy we have. Because, as I mentioned, nuclear plants operate 24/7, 365. We only shut down every either 18 or 24 months for refueling. So another way to look at that is our nuclear fleet has a capacity factor of 95%, which means they're owned and operating 95% of the time, and other forms of generation just can't do that. But we're working very hard to maximize our existing fleet to make them even more efficient and to generate even more electricity because that will help address the growth that we know is going to continue. And we're doing that in a few ways by pursuing subsequent license renewals for all 11 units to extend the operating life from 60 years up to 80 years. We're also adding nearly 300 megawatts of additional capacity to the existing units. And third, we're transitioning 3 of our stations to 24-month fuel cycles instead of the 18-month fuel cycles. So I kind of like to say we're going to operate them longer, more, and more often. So we can take those 3 things kind of one at a time. First, longer, subsequent license renewals. So the U.S. nuclear power plants were originally licensed by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission for 40 years of operation, and that was for economic reasons, not technical reasons. The regulations do allow that the licenses can be renewed for an additional 20 years. And so all of our Duke Energy nuclear plants have received an initial license renewal to achieve up to 60 years of operation. So now we're at the place where we're pursuing subsequent license renewals for the entire fleet. We plan to do this for all 11 units so that they can operate from 60 years up to 80 years. And that will enable mid-century operations up to the 2050s. I'm very happy to say that on March 31st of this year, we received subsequent renewed licenses for Oconee Nuclear Station's 3 units in Seneca, South Carolina. That's our largest nuclear plant. And on the next day, on April 1st, we submitted a subsequent license renewal application to the NRC for our Robinson nuclear plant in Hartsville, South Carolina. So that's license renewals. The second part of the strategy is operating more. The power uprates, which an uprate for a nuclear plant is increasing the licensed thermal power output of the plant. And so we can add megawatts to our existing fleet, and we plan to do so, adding about 300 megawatts of capacity at 4 of our 6 plants. We've already realized about 45 of those megawatts at the Oconee Nuclear Station. Many plants in the U.S. have implemented power uprates, and it involves upgrading some components and requires approval from the NRC. The third part of the strategy is operating more often. So 3 of our stations refuel every 18 months and the other 3 every 24 months. We plan to transition the 3 stations that currently refuel every 18 months to 24 months refueling outages later this decade. I mentioned that nuclear plants operate at about a 95% capacity factor, and this will allow that to be even higher by requiring fewer shutdowns and increasing the online time of those units.
That's great. So, Renat, these plants, this entire fleet are on these fairly, thickly settled regions of the country. This isn't as if it's in the Midwest in the mountains somewhere. And, growing up in the Northeast, whether it's Seabrook in New Hampshire or Indian Point in New York, they've always been controversial. Communities have always pushed back to some degree. So can you talk, but that was in the 70s and 80s. So where we are today is far different, particularly from a energy standpoint. Talk to us about what's the relationship like with the communities where these plants are located?
Absolutely. The conversation is different today, but we at Duke Energy, we are privileged to operate nuclear power plants in communities in the Carolinas, and we do have great relationships with those who live near our plants. Our nuclear workers live and work in the communities where the plants operate. So most times, just about everybody in the community knows someone who works at the plant. But to be clear, this positive community engagement doesn't just happen. We work consistently to educate community members about what we do at our nuclear stations. 4 of our 6 nuclear sites have energy education centers where we bring members of the public in to help them learn about nuclear energy. And that's a great resource for the community. And you mentioned the 70s and 80s, and the narrative around nuclear really has shifted in the past decade or so, with more people across the political spectrum supporting nuclear energy. According to the Nuclear Energy Institute, more people agree we need nuclear to meet this moment. A recent public opinion survey found public support for nuclear energy increased 18 percentage points in the past 5 years, between 2019 and 2024. And so while there's a growing consensus around nuclear energy, there's still a lot of misconceptions, particularly as we think about new nuclear. And the topics we receive the most questions on include safety, used fuel storage, environmental impacts, and reliability. And we have a good story to tell on all of these topics, but it takes time and effort to help those outside the industry understand it like we do. So for communities that don't have a nuclear plant in their backyard or maybe aren't familiar with the technology, we do still have a lot of opportunities to educate, particularly as we think about potential new nuclear projects. We see stakeholder engagement as an essential part of our project plan. For example, we're working with stakeholders around the Blues Creek site that we've selected for new nuclear deployment in North Carolina. We met with the community even before we selected the site. We continue to be intentional about listening to their concerns and seeking feedback and responding to questions as the project progresses. The nearest existing nuclear plant to that location is about 90 miles away. And so one of the things we did was actually took some community leaders on a plant tour of one of our operating nuclear plants. And that allowed them to see for themselves what a nuclear community looks like and what the plant looks like.
That's really interesting. I'm sure that tours like that are really beneficial. Let's talk for a moment about the new nuclear. So you're engaging with stakeholders, you're looking at new projects, you're exploring new advanced, nuclear deployments, teaming up with industry, pursuing federal funding. Can you talk more about it? Like, how's it all coming? Is it all coming together? And then perhaps interject any perspective on the new administration and their perspective on this. Just love to get your thoughts on it.
That's a good question. And we, as I've said, we believe nuclear energy has and will continue to play an essential role in meeting our customers' energy demands. But, we really are seeing bipartisan support right now. And so, as you said, we're strongly committed to exploring the potential for new nuclear, including small modular reactors. And so we're doing that in a few ways. We continue to make progress on the small modular reactors, or SMRs, with an eye towards bringing the first unit online in the mid-2030s. I mentioned earlier that we've selected a site near the Blues Creek Steam Station. This is a 1,000-acre site in Stokes County, North Carolina, and we're looking at that site for potential advanced nuclear deployment. It is adjacent to an existing steam station, a Duke Energy steam station, a 2,200 megawatt plant that uses coal and natural gas today to produce energy. That station is scheduled for retirement in the mid-2030s, and so repurposing that site for nuclear benefits our employees and our local community and the customers. So our plan for now is we're developing an early site permit application for the site. And this is a risk mitigation strategy that gains regulatory finality on the site environmental and safety topics. And the permit resolves these topics with the NRC on the front end of the project and confirms the site's suitability for new nuclear generation. And to the earlier discussion around stakeholders, the NRC's process to permit and receive regulatory approval for advanced nuclear projects, it's complex and it's lengthy, but it includes providing ample opportunities for stakeholders to participate in that process and provide input. You mentioned industry collaboration and the DOE. And nuclear industry has a long history of industry collaboration, and we think that's so important to advance new nuclear technologies, to gather lessons learned from our peers and assess risk to identify the technologies that offer the best value to our customers. So one of the recent things that we've done that you may have heard or read about is we're participating in a DOE grant opportunity alongside the Tennessee Valley Authority and other entities. And this will allow us to build on our ongoing SMR evaluation in a highly cost-effective and measured way. Our participation in this coalition on SMRs supports near-term actions for new nuclear, including due diligence required to generate the support for the growth in the Carolinas. So Duke Energy's involvement is focused on advancing the standard design of the GE Hitachi's BWRX 300 for licensing purposes. And this is consistent with our Carolinas Resource Plan orders that I mentioned earlier and our state regulators who have asked us to evaluate new nuclear options.
Great. That sounds like there's a lot going on there. So we can't have a discussion about, and power perspectives without pulling in policymakers and regulators. They certainly have a voice in this. So you talked about stakeholders, talked about education, talked about NERC, talked about, what's currently going on. So there's already sort of this culture of acceptance, but any kind of new nuclear upgrades and so on that you're doing there, what has been the perspective or the experience been with working with regulators, policymakers and such around these topics?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Our stakeholders include not only communities, but also the regulators and policymakers. And so we continue to receive support from state and federal policymakers. And it's really important that continue for our existing fleet and for new nuclear to be part of the solution. So, for example, starting with the federal policies, the federal nuclear production tax credit, this incentivizes our existing plants to operate as cost efficiently as possible, and that lowers the cost of nuclear energy for our customers. And so it is absolutely important that those tax credits are preserved for the benefit of our customers. At the state level, I'd point to some recent trends from the Nuclear Energy Institute, which show a flurry of recent activity by state legislatures around nuclear energy. Many states over the last year or so are commissioning task forces to explore nuclear. They're passing legislation to recognize nuclear as a clean energy resource. And they're removing barriers and incentivizing new nuclear and supply chains. And this is happening in most of the states that Duke Energy serves.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a renaissance going on. So you mentioned small modular reactors earlier. So I want to pull on that thread for a moment. So, nuclear, as we understand, nuclear is a mature technology, right? So it's been around for a while. We've gotten good at it, but we've also paused and walked away from it. So now we've got a new generation of technologies coming in. Although, correct me if I'm wrong here, but small modular reactors, and I think even molten salt reactors have been in existence in like a pilot or study phase at the national labs for quite some time, 30, 40 years. So it's not as if so new, but new to coming to market. But talk to us about that. We're seeing new developments, on technology. How is Duke processing this? What are the considerations that Duke takes in when looking at this new technology?
You are exactly right. There is so much going on. But we do have a long history, more than 50 years of operating our large light water reactors. And even though the U.S. as a whole hasn't really been constructing new nuclear plants since the 100 or so reactors that came online in the 70s and 80s, there are so many new nuclear designs that have come available in recent years, and they're in various stages of maturity. There's one that has been built recently, and that's the Westinghouse AP1000 reactors that operate at Plant Vogtle in Waynesboro, Georgia. They just came online in the last couple of years, and so the industry does have some recent experience and lessons learned from those two units. There are some other large designs similar to that. And there are also some small designs, as we've talked about, the small modular reactors, which are typically around 300 megawatts as compared to the 1,000 or so megawatts in the nuclear fleet that operates in the U.S. today. So I mentioned GE Hitachi's BWRX 300 earlier. Westinghouse also has an AP300, which is a scaled down version of the AP1000 that operates at Vogtle. You mentioned designs that use coolants other than water, like molten salts and high temperature gas. There are several of those. One molten salt design is the TerraPower design, and that's being planned for construction in Kimmerer, Wyoming. And so you're right. Some of these designs have been in various stages at the national labs through the years, but they haven't been built commercially really yet in the U.S. And so there's still a lot of unknowns in terms of licensing, construction timelines, cost, operating experience. And so we're really trying to dig deep into all of that experience. And we're interested in collaborating with several of those designs. I mentioned what we're doing with GE, Hitachi, and the Tennessee Valley Authority. We're also involved with the TerraPower design as they develop their advanced reactor. We have several employees who support that design and are embedded in the TerraPower organization, and they're developing an operations and training program for that design, which is really a win-win because TerraPower gets the experience of some of our operators and training experts, and then we bring a lot of the experience from TerraPower back to our efforts. So beyond the technology itself, there are other things to consider in siting a new nuclear plant. And so water availability is the most important factor. You have to have the water for cooling. Existing infrastructure is important, such as the transmission corridors. If they're already in place, that's beneficial. Having railway availability for construction is also helpful for heavy hauls. And then a skilled workforce, which is why, conversion from coal to nuclear is so attractive. But as a regulated utility, we're evaluating all the opportunities to deploy new nuclear, and our customers are always front and center for all the decisions that we make. So we're working to be sure that we maintain reliability while keeping costs as low as possible for our customers. So it's not just about what technology will get the job done. There are many that will get the job done. But what are the costs and what are the risks, and, incorporating the stakeholder input that's necessary to move forward. That's really our focus for a project.
So I'd love for you to share, if you can, what Duke's nuclear energy fleet will look like in the next 3 to 5 years. And will it be more of the same, or will it be transformative? Just how can you, if you're able to describe it, can you go into just sort of what the next few years should look like pertaining to Duke's Energy's nuclear fleet?
Oh, I would love to. So we are seeing a transformation. So I don't think it's going to be more of the same. We do see a bright future for nuclear. And when we think of our nuclear strategy, we think of it and talk about it in terms of today, tomorrow, and the future. So today, we'll continue operating the largest regulated nuclear fleet in the country. We'll do so safely and reliably and efficiently. Tomorrow, we'll do those 3 things I mentioned earlier. The subsequent license renewal to extend the operating life of the units, the uprates to produce more energy out of the current fleet, and then also the 24-month cycles, which allow the units to operate more and shut down less. So that's the tomorrow strategy. And then for the future, we're going to continue to make progress on these near-term activities to support the potential advanced nuclear deployment, ensuring that that's a viable option by the mid-2030s, but making sure that we're balancing the needs of our customers and our communities and our investors in all those decisions we make. So your listeners can expect to hear more about what's next for Duke Energy later this year when we file that updated resource plan that I mentioned earlier for the Carolinas. The Carolinas resource plan is due this fall, and it will outline our latest thinking in nuclear's role for our energy future.
Well, fantastic, Runette. We really appreciate your insight and, greatly appreciate your time with us today. We want to give you the final word, but before we get to that, we're going to go to what we call the lightning round, which is an opportunity to learn a little bit more about you, the person, rather than you, the professional. So I'm going to throw a bunch of questions at you. We ask you to keep your response to one word or phrase. Are you ready?
Ready.
Okay. Here we go. Question number 1. If you could have any superpower, what would it be?
Teleportation, without a doubt.
How do you unwind after a stressful day?
Right now, we watch an episode of whatever series we're into. We're watching West Wing right now.
What is one thing of the past that you would like to see come back?
Sesame Street. Sesame Street debuted 1 month before I was born, and so it is sad to think of a world without Sesame Street.
We're collecting questions from previous podcast guests. So we have a question here from Laura Lewis of SMUD, and she wants to hear from a future guest the following. What are some strategies for increasing engagement and participation in customer programs? Would you have a perspective, given that you're working with communities as it relates to nuclear?
We like to say, listen, learn, and adjust. That's a short and sweet phrase, and that's what we do in all of our interactions.
All right, Renette, now it's your turn. We're going to turn the table back over to you to ask a future guest a question. And it can be topical and related to energy, or it can be something that's off the wall. It's your call.
Well, we've talked about so much going on in the industry today in energy. And so I'd like to hear from others how they stay informed on all the latest developments and breakthroughs going on in their field of technology, because it's hard to keep up.
I like that. Well, I could use that. Be curious to hear what people say. All right, fantastic. And a question we ask all our guests: what are you most motivated by?
I like to know that I'm making a difference. So my role and subsequent license renewal in particular means I get to play a role in keeping a plant operating for 20 more years. That means, hundreds of people get to keep their jobs and the community gets to continue to thrive. So making that difference really is what motivates me.
Well, fantastic. And I swore I'd give you the final word. So knowing that you have an audience of utility executives and policymakers listening in, what would you say to these leaders, maybe in other parts of the country, who are watching Duke Energy's nuclear moves with interest, but haven't made the similar investments? What should they be thinking of?
Yeah, so I guess finally I would say we've really seen success by focusing on two things. First, what we've talked about a lot, which is earning the trust of our communities by operating our nuclear plants safely, reliably, and with excellence all day, every day. That's the ticket to the game. And then second, really by creating new advocates, by listening and learning from our stakeholders and educating them about the incredible benefits that nuclear energy provides. So if we can continue to do these two things, I think the future of nuclear certainly looks bright.
Absolutely. And, can't underestimate the weight on your shoulders with what you're working on and carrying at Duke Energy. So, this is a very important discussion that I'm sure that our listeners will stay engaged and post questions and comments on the podcast forum. And Renette, we welcome you to stay engaged with those listeners to answer any of the questions they may have. But I do want to thank you. You're a very busy woman. Really appreciate your time, your insight, and taking a moment of your day to share your wisdom here at the podcast. So thank you again for this.
A pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. And as I mentioned, for our listeners, Renette welcomes your questions and comments. And we also want to give a shout out of thanks to the podcast sponsors that made today's episode possible. Thanks to West Monroe. West Monroe is a leading partner for the nation's largest electric, gas, and water utilities, working together to drive grid modernization, clean energy, workforce transformation. West Monroe's comprehensive services are designed to support utilities in advancing their digital transformation, building resilient operations, securing federal funding, and providing regulatory advisory support. With a multidisciplinary team of experts, West Monroe offers a holistic approach that addresses the challenges of the grid today and provides innovative solutions for a sustainable future. Once again, I'm your host, Jason Price. Plug in and stay fully charged in the discussion by hopping into the community at energycentral.com, and we'll see you next time at the Energy Central Power Perspectives Podcast.